Alrighty, guys. Um, so let's get started. I guess we can go over rules of engagement and so on again. You can leave your camera off, and you guys can stay muted unless you have a question. I don't mind if you pop questions into chat or into voice. As usual, I'll record this. I'll get it up there this afternoon for people who are not here now and to review, right? It's always helpful to watch this stuff once and then to attempt it yourself later. We're gonna go pretty fast this week because I want you guys to get started texturing and understanding texturing in video games. Usually I would do a little bit more of primitives modeling and things like this where we practice making shapes and things, but I think it's going to be good to jump right into where we're making game ready models, right? Because as you'll see today, and as we looked at a little bit last week, each engine or each software package will have its own method of texturing or of applying materials or shaders. Our job, right, is to make the stuff come out of one software package and to make it appear in Unity and work as it should. So hopefully you guys had fun texturing the 3D models. I know that was a bit of a like chuck you into the deep end assignment, but I wanted to see how you guys problem solved, right? I think it's a good way to do it because the only way that this stuff is going to stick is if you solve these problems yourself. I can shout at you all day or give you every tip in the book, and like it'll just go right through and out the other side. The only way to do it is to figure it out, and so that's why you might hear people say, "Oh, I'm self-taught," or but really everybody who does art is self-taught, right? Because it's whatever mistakes we can live with become our art style, right? Our own approach. And for something technical like this that combines creativity and technical side of the brain, you have to be able to manage your own motivations and processes, right? Like internally, so that you actually produce results. So hopefully you guys didn't have too many issues. If you did, right, just pop them into chat or you can stop right now to look at what kinds of things people run into. But I think everybody managed to get, the texture change and the screenshot up there. And we get started on the journey of like making our own art assets for games, which is fun. This is how I got into making art for games, and it's just like cool because we have all this existing content online, right, including copyrighted stuff that we would never have been able to get our hands on 10 years ago, but now it's all in the ball pit, so we can jump in there and play. One thing I'm not sure if I mentioned last week, but if you're getting this issue where you want to paint in Photoshop and have it refresh in Maya, it won't do that automatically, right? Even if you save your Photoshop document. It does work for some file types. If you guys were using PNGs, you might not have run into this. But for Photoshop documents, Maya can read Photoshop documents. And if it's not refreshing, typically all you need to do is close the Hypershade editor. We're going to look at that in more detail today. And just reopen it, and it'll refresh the that file up on the model. So UV unwrapping, let's go. So the process, right, of UV unwrapping is kind of a necessary evil because we need the computer to be able to project textures onto a 3D model, right, that has curvature. The way that the computer normally thinks is via angles, right, in space, in 3D space. And our job, right, is to make sure that it can understand that something flat is getting projected onto a 3D space and leaves an imprint there, right? It's like doing a little cutout spray paint. You could look at it that way, or actual like overhead projectors, right? In space, kind of like shooting beams down at objects, right? And then that beam is like has the picture that the projector is mapping onto the object. Um, Another way to think of it is like if you made a paper airplane and then you drew on the airplane, right? And then you unfold it again, right? It wouldn't necessarily be the same looking art, right? Everything would be moved around and things, but all the same pieces would still be there. So UV unwrapping, right, is definitely made so that the computer can understand our desire to put things into 3D. And now, right, there are programs out there that will let you paint directly onto objects, and they have been for a while. But just know that to do that, it's almost like it has to have that camera like flying around in space, right? And have like a map of the object from all degrees. So it's a lot of math and programming that coders have to solve a lot of problems to get that working. So our goal for creating textures, right, is to have nice and sharp textures, right? No smudging, no stretching. We're used to looking at these bad boys for X many hours a day, and they all have like super high resolution images, um, pixel perfect, sharp, clean lines, right? UIs that have been designed by the best of the best in the world. So it jumps out at us when we see things like even weird little artifacts like the crusty little black pixels on the edges of this model, right? Like we can see these things because we're so used to looking at perfection. So as artists, right, we're also stuck in that world of, okay, we have to make it pixel perfect, right? It's not just about like getting it sort of right. And some of you guys probably noticed this when you're painting, right? That sometimes you're painting one thing, like I was painting the hat and I was like, oh, the pixels went over like a tiny bit, doesn't really matter. But then it'll be like a big blob on the face or something like that, right? And that's because all of these 2D textures, right, that are being mapped onto the 3D object are so smushed together within this U1V1 space, right, the square that we're using to put textures in. So it is important also to remember to use square textures for game objects. And this has to do with a memory optimization thing, right, where the way that data is pushed into the graphics card memory requires things to be, well, doesn't require, but the way that the hardware is set up, right, it's almost like it has these chunks of memory, and we want to have things match the size of the memory to take advantage of it. If things are the wrong size, right, if we have like some rectangles going into a square hole, we're kind of like not using our memory efficiently, so we lose efficiency in our game. The other reason that we're using textures, like I mentioned, right, is so that we can transport things between different applications and get them into Unity. So let's just jump in right into what kinds of things we need to look out for when we're making our own 3D objects, right? Because that's kind of our goal of this class is to be able to make our own props, our own environment models, and eventually our own characters within 3D games. Next year, you guys will be working in Maya and Unity with me for 3D level design, most likely. And the more that you can take ownership of the assets in your game, right, the more you people are going to be impressed, because you can put something in front of somebody and you don't have to qualify it. You don't have to be like, oh, well, I made this game, but really like I got 90% of my assets from the asset store. Like, okay, well then I'm gonna look, if you're talking to somebody experienced, say a designer, they can be like, okay, well, I know how to look just at the mechanics of the game, and I'll try and like ignore, right? I'll put on the blinders and I'll ignore the other parts that maybe you didn't make. But it's hard to do that, right? Especially for somebody higher up who's not as familiar with the process. And we deal with those people all the time, right? Because management, producers, investors, right, are all part of the game industry. We need to play their game so that they give us money to make beautiful games and fun things. So our job as artists, right, is to make convincing assets and to make them right the first time, and hopefully be able to make all the parts that we foresee in our game, right, when we come up with that concept. So I think these three things are extremely important for reaching the goal of having sort of solid feeling, professional looking, and game ready assets, right? Um, there's always the question of scale in 3D, because you can create something any size, right? You can make a sphere and it could be like, okay, this sphere is a bouncing ball. And then you can make a sphere right next to it and be like, okay, this sphere is Jupiter. And the 3D program can calculate the difference, right? If you scale Jupiter up all the way to the planet size, or if you scale the bouncing ball up, it's all the same to an application. So our job is to find, the relative scale. Like, how do we make sure that two things that are next to each other appear correct because they're both scaled similarly? And for that, I normally advise scaling things to the size of the player avatar or the character in your game. That's going to just make sure that everything follows the same baseline, right? You don't want to necessarily be like, okay, well, the first thing I modeled was a screwdriver, so now I'm going to model a car, and the car has to match the scale of the screwdriver, and it becomes quite difficult, right? Whereas if you have a human, it's kind of a middle ground, and you can look at how well things fit that human. All right, so scale. Um, it's good visually because if we can spot something that we recognize, we can instantly like guess how big something next to it is going to be, right? So in this case, we've got the mouse with the wrench with that spanner, and that just tells us approximately how big this character is, right? So one tip that I give to people, especially when you're assembling a scene with multiple objects, right, is to find something that everybody kind of knows the size of, whether it's going to be, a cell phone or a Coke can or a tree or a car or anything like this, right? So especially things that fit human scale, right? That's going to make things easier across the board. But depending on the scale and what you're putting in your scene, it might get kind of crazy in there, right? You might have some Lovecraftian horror scene that has like a cave with Gollum in it, and like you might want the audience to know that this is a really big cave, right? But it's a cave, so it's like it could be small, it could be big. Your brain might not be able to tell unless you put some visual indicators in there so that somebody can guesstimate, how tall the ceiling is. All right, so the next one is function, right? What kind of purpose does this object serve, and how is it used by people, or by characters in your game? So when we look at something different, right, for the first time, something stylized, something that's been artistically sort of twisted, um, we're immediately going to look for the big objects, on that object, the big shapes that tell us what that might be. And that also includes the proportions, right? Like how far things are from each other is also important. So in this case, right, you might notice, at least I noticed the tires first, and then, your brain kind of like says, okay, if the tires are this far apart, oh, there's some other parts here that would fit like a motorcycle type of shape or a four-wheeler type of shape. And then you can start to look for other visual indicators, right? Like the handlebars, um, the seat is another big one, right? So whenever you have something that a character can interact with, that just kind of like cements or locks in that's the size of that object in the game. Yeah. And then personality, right? This is more of the X factor. It's the weird one, or the one that you can't just um, execute mechanically, right? It comes from somewhere else. It comes from a deeper place or from a more heartfelt place. And it's more about like the vibe check, right? Like what kind of vibes is this thing giving off? Is it evil? Is it good? Is it friendly? Right? We have to be able to like instantly make these judgments in real life, especially out here on the streets of London, right? You gotta be able to spot that crazy person from 100 yards so that you can take that left turn and avoid a little confrontation maybe. Um, so we have this stuff wired into our brain, right, where we can kind of uh, make an instantaneous decision about, is something going to be a problem for us, or is it going to be something that helps us? Yeah. So we can pull some of that out of like the deep lizard parts of our brain, right, and look for what kind of visual stimuli will actually like set that off, right? Whether it's going to be like evil, glowing red eyes, right, which also kind of look like, I feel like in this like a traffic light, right, where it's like stop. Um, so there are going to be things that you can put onto um, your models and your characters and things like that, that'll instantaneously like give you a gut reaction or that like feeling. Um, so listen to your gut, right? Listen to what your gut is telling you about what that object is saying to you. And one thing that can help with this is if you have a focal point, especially one that looks kind of like a face, right? We were all impressed by Jamie's Austin robot, for example. And I feel like when I saw it with the texture, right, and it had kind of the face part, gives you that focal point that your eyes going to jump to, and then everything else kind of makes sense around it. So really, really awesome work. And yeah, hopefully you guys also jump on the train of making giant robots or whatever else makes you happy. All right, so when you're looking at concept art, when you're looking at 3D art, and especially when you're looking at your own art, right? Look for these three things and make sure that they are that those boxes are getting ticked. Um, so if we look at some other art, right, we can start to pick apart where things are working and maybe what visual indicators are giving us that information, right? So if we look at something like this and we're like, okay, what tells us the scale, right? It's like, okay, well, we understand it's a tank, but is it like a chibi tank? Is it like a tiny little tank, or is it kind of just a big tank with strange proportions, right? Um, and so in this case, they make you look a little bit harder than just like the main face of the object, right? Which is kind of the attention grabber. And I feel like the treads are giving us the function, right? But then we can start to see like, oh, okay, there's a log back here, and there are like handheld tools, right? Which immediately tells us how big a human or a character will be next to this object. And look for the personality as well, right? Of course, like they've done a nice job giving it that kind of blank C3PO robot stare, right, in the front. Um, but it's also got some nice weathering or bits that are rusted or where the paint's been stripped. And it's also got a silly name and things, giving it the impression that um, it belongs to a specific crew or a specific owner that's taking care of this in a certain way. Here's another fun one. This is these are all from ArtStation, so none of these are mine, unfortunately. But I try to include the links when I've put some artwork up here, so that you guys can go dig up the artists if you want to go take a look at their other work. Well, not dig them up, because that would mean they were dead, and they're not painters. All the painters are dead, but the 3D artists are alive and kicking. So again, scale, function, personality in here, right? So in this case, we can look for things like handles, indicating hand size, right? With the gun, with the book. Um, for function, right? We can see a few different things going on in here that would imply what the functions are. Whether it's like smaller details like the anatomy book, or these little poison bottles and things, possibly silver bullets. These little vampire hunting kits were um, kind of a kitschy thing. I think it must have been in the early 1900s that it was a thing. So some of these kids still survive and things, but now it's just more of a fun little distraction, to look back at that time and see what people were thinking. Even something a little bit simpler, right? Scale, function, personality. When we're looking at something like this, it's not immediately obvious maybe what the scale is until, unless you recognize the film projector elements, right? Like the lens and the film reels, right? That kind of gives us a sense like, okay, the film reels would be about this big, and then we can start to extrapolate what size the other things are. The function, again, comes from the same pieces. The personality, is a little bit more utilitarian. It just has one job, and hopefully it does its job. So it's also worth looking at some where they appear to be missing something, right? Where the elements are there, maybe, but maybe one is a bit weaker or too weak to really stand out. And you'll see this a lot when, um, especially when students first start out in 3D modeling, right? You go through this whole technical process, and that kind of changes your art, right? Because it forces you to work within this very tight box. And the first time that you climb into that box, it's going to feel really cramped, right? It's not until you start to kind of stretch out and push yourself that you can push those technical limitations out and make your box a little bit bigger, so that way you can play in there and find the fun parts, right? So in this case, right, we've got a couple things that tell us the scale. We all know the size of these things. We all know the function of a keyboard, right, and of a small home desk. But it's sort of lacking in personality, right? It needs a little bit more of a kick just to like push it over the line and make it decent. Because there's plenty of good stuff going on here, but it's not clear, whose desk this is. It kind of comes off as a IKEA catalog, right? Where it's just like, this is a desk that exists in the perfect household where, nobody actually lives, but there are um, things going on. Let me just make sure we don't have any late joiners. Where's participants? Again, nobody in waiting room. Cool. So here again, scale, function, personality, right? Scale, we can kind of guess based on these little dials, right? They look like they're little dials meant to be turned. And also has like a QR code there, right? Generally, QR codes fall within a certain size. Um, we might not be sure about the function of this object though, right? Because there aren't that many clues on here as to what this thing actually does. Personality, I feel like it's a bit weak, but it could also just be because it is also meant for a specific utility, right? It's a part of something larger. Um, but in this case, this is a laser sight that's going to go on a gun model. So it's a little hard to infer, right, from all the pieces that are there, even though it looks like it was done off of a real object, right, that it was modeled from reality. It's still not quite clear to the average viewer, at least what this little machine might do. Yeah. So here's one from Demon Souls. Maybe some of you guys recognize, but it's also a tricky one to figure out exactly what it is, right? Like, okay, scale. Um, there's some things in here like the rivets that we can kind of infer the scale from, right? And then it's like, okay, this is kind of like a Renaissance armor, like we were looking at last week, where it's got all these nice little engravings and things. So we can kind of infer a little bit of scale from that. It's definitely got a lot of personality, right? It's got a kind of danger element, and it's got a well-crafted feel to it. Function is the one that falls flat here a little bit, right? It's like, what is this thing? Like, what do you even do with it? And in this case, it is like a gauntlet that you like punch with. So it's like the point thing is going to go on the end of your fist. So it's a good 3D model, right? There's lots of cool detail on here, but it's not immediately obvious what it is. Yeah, and it does bring to mind armor, right? But and that's what I thought. So I was like, oh, okay, is it like a shoulder piece, or does it go up here, or does it go like, where does it go? So you want to give your viewer some clues, right? If it's kind of lacking like this, or if it seems to be missing something, or you're forcing people to guess maybe what it is. And I think I forgot to include any, but only because they're so ubiquitous, is weapons in general, right? The thing that you're going to see a million of if you look for 3D models are guns, swords, right? Knives, axes, cars, down the line a little bit once you get to more advanced. But the reason for this, right, is guns and swords, right? They both are easy to tick those first boxes, right? We know the scale because it's going to fit into our hand either way. We know a function, right, which is violence, killing things, whatever it is, and even things that maybe we don't like in real life. They're attractive in games because they just sit so nicely within that scale and function formula, right? They just jump out at us like, oh, I know exactly what to do with that. I know how to hold it. Um, so when you're designing weapons for the upcoming project, right? We're not going to look at that just yet. Maybe next week we'll start on that one. The trick really, right, is capturing some personality in that weapon. I guess I have X at the top here, right? So when you're looking at something where the scale and the function are rather obvious, right? Then you have to start to think, okay, what's the personality of this object or of the character that wields this object, right? That's the final piece of the puzzle. It's going to bridge everything together and make it stand out as something that we want to keep looking at and that we want to go in and find in the game, right? And add to our collection. Or if it's just like, oh, it's another generic one, it doesn't look special at all, right? It's not one of the rare drops or anything like that in the game. So typically, right, for a weapon, we look at things like, did the user inscribe something on it? What materials is it made out of, right? That would imply where that person lives or what age they come from, right? With what kind of society that they live in. And so we almost become, like we get pulled into the history of that object. So that's something that's important to look at when adding these things to your objects, right? The scale, the function, and the personality. Giving it a little bit of detail that's going to tell the viewer where it's from, what it's used for, right? How big it is. All of that information just helps it stick in our brains a little bit better. So you want to do this at multiple scales within your object as well. It's not just that like, okay, you just add one little sticker, and you call it a day. Typically, you want to have shapes in your object that are going to give these clues, both at the large scale and in the small details. That way, the more different sizes of shapes that you have on your object, right, it leads your eye around the object. And even something without a texture like this has enough little details in here that it'll keep us looking at it, just because there are lots of things to look at, right, at different sizes, where we have kind of like, okay, we have this overall bench shape and then the anvil on top, but then the smaller pieces than the anvil, right? We have the ring, we have the hammer down here, and then the very small pieces, right, like the nails and the little tie bits, like all of this stuff has got just that little bit extra personality in it, which makes it fun to look at. Whereas I feel like this one failed a little bit because even though it's got some really nice details when you look up close, everything is kind of the same size, about the size of like an orange, right, or a piece of fruit. And there's so many things that are the same exact size in here that it's like, okay, how many little shapes do I have to look at to get all the information, right? Like your eye has to bounce and bounce and bounce, and you're just like, all right, I'm done looking at this thing. Um, And I feel like this is where sort of the Transformers movies went wrong, right? It's like they put all the detail at this very small level, so you end up having to like squint and be like, well, does it matter that like the core is over there and like the arm joint is over there? And it's like, what is all this stuff? Like, does it matter? Um, and if the answer is no, right, then it doesn't need to be there. Rather, grab the big shapes, right, and then work your way down to small shapes rather than working everything within the same detail level. Alrighty, so we're gonna take a break. Can you guys download this file for me so we can jump onto it when we come back? Let's do 15 minutes, so 10:51, we'll come back. That last 20 minutes of me talking. So those slides are there, luckily, but we'll start recording. Do we lost the Clio can? Clio moved. All right, so where to start? Let's go for Mr. Barrel first. So when we look at a completed object, right, like we did with the character model, right, we can see on that object what the texture layout, what the UV layout has become when we open up this thing called the UV editor. So if you're under the modeling tab, which is F2, go to the UV menu up at the top, kind of towards the right side, and look at the top here is the UV editor. That's going to bring up this window here. If we click on these little mountains with the sun over them or with the moon over them, we can actually see that texture that is being applied to that object, right? And within the UV editor, we still have access to our holding right-click menu, right? So we can select faces over here, and they are going to, as you can see, correspond to faces or polygons on the model itself, right? And vice versa. If I'm in the viewport, I can select faces and be like, okay, where is the bottom of this hat? You know, so I'm holding tab to drag select just to see where the hat is. I can be like, oh, okay, that's that area. There's the hat. So now if I want to go into Photoshop, that's where I'm going to edit, right? If you move things in 3D, right, they're going to stretch just because there are now different shapes between here and the UV editor. The goal is to get each of these triangles in this case. I know it's not great having a triangulated mesh, but a lot of game meshes are triangulated. It would be to get these shapes represented in 2D as close as possible to if I am like sitting here in 3D space, like looking at them with the camera at a perpendicular angle, right? So if we can get that 3D shape to be flattened in the right size, right, that's when we get zero stretching. So the other tools that we have, right, edges, we can also be moving edges around. And if you start to move things within the UV editor, right, things will happen in the texture in the 3D space immediately, right? So this is all real time. So sometimes it's about eyeballing it, right? A lot of this art stuff, you know, we don't necessarily get 100% exact 100% of the time. Sometimes we only get to 90%, right? But trying to get as close as possible visually is going to be our goal. Yeah. So that's a very complex object, obviously. Let's look at something simpler like our barrel here. So if we go to the barrel and we choose the UV editor, here we can see the texture, right? The texture again is this little green button underneath help, which is going to display and hide the texture. And then we can see where these 3D parts have been mapped onto the 2D space, and including the top of the barrel. Yeah, so if I look at this barrel over here, I've just used the defaults for this, which is if I went to UV and I chose automatic, it produces this result. I can also change it to something like a spherical result, right? And again, what it's trying to do is it's trying to map all of these 3D shapes that are connected, right, into a single object that's also connected in 2D space. So in some cases, you might get lucky and it'll get close. But in this case, right, we're actually going to be working backwards from a texture where we already have a texture and we're just going to try and fix the UVs a little bit, yeah? So what we can do is select individual faces and unwrap them using the UV menu. And for the most part, we can get away with using the automatic unwrap. But I also like to show you guys and have you use some of these other ones, including the cylindrical, the planar, spherical, and camera-based. So what automatic is going to do, right, is it's going to look at the object and look for any large flat areas and try to make them flat in 2D. So it's done a good job with the top and the bottom of the barrel. Once I have this in my UV editor, right, I'll change into face mode. And generally, I'm going to move the faces off to the side, right, anywhere over on the edge there. This is like building a puzzle where you want to have the majority of the pieces that you haven't sorted yet, right, out on the outskirts. And as you start to put things into place, right, they'll go back in the center. So here I have the top of the barrel, right? I can see that because I have it selected in the scene. And if I move it around inside of the UV editor, right, it's going to change which texture is being displayed, right? So I look for the top of the barrel, which is this one in the bottom right here. And I kind of line it up. And in this case, I want to grow using R, right, to scale, so that I can grab the edges of the metal within that texture. So again, if you zoom in on your barrel object, you can hit F to focus, and it will focus on the face that I have selected, right? Then I have to kind of eyeball it over here in the UV editor to get it so that it takes up the largest amount of space, right, without going over the edge. If it does go over the edge, I can get some different kind of results. Not really what I'm looking for, but maybe it looks okay. I also want to try and avoid having any overlap between the edge of this square here, right? This is called the U1 V1 or U0 V0 square. And we can see that by going to the checker map or the checkerboard mode. So this one, it's a little bit hard to see. If I move the barrel back over here, we can see where the U1 V1 pops up. U1 V1, there it is. All right, so back to the barrel, right? I want to show texture rather than that. So now I have the top in place, right? Now I can rotate around and I can select the bottom of the barrel over here, or if I select it in the UV editor and I want to move it back over here to take its place in the correct place on the texture, and then I will line it up. One thing to keep in mind, right, is if you are zoomed out and you move things over, it might be hard to control and get things pixel perfect. It's good to know that you can zoom in almost infinitely, inside the UV editor. So even if you can't really see what you're doing, you can zoom in on the manipulate arms here. And if I move these, right, when I'm far zoomed in, the movement will be a lot less in the 3D space, right? So you can fine tune things a little bit more if you're zoomed in. Yeah, R to scale. Right, same thing goes here. Another trick that I sometimes use if I'm really trying to get things lined up, right? Say if I want to move it over ever so slightly, I won't just drag my mouse to the right or drag my mouse to the left. I'll actually drag my mouse up at a diagonal angle. It will ignore any upward motion, right? Any Y on the mouse, and it will only detect that side-to-side motion if I'm holding the arrow, right? So if I drag upwards, and slightly to the right, it's a little bit easier. You can move your mouse further, right, and still get a very small adjustment, right? Whereas if you're trying to just move left and just move right with your mouse, sometimes it gets frustrating because things are moving too much. All right, so top and the bottom, they look good. Another thing to remember as an artist and painters, this is a painter technique, is to zoom out and look at your object from the distance that the camera would be looking at it in the game, right? You don't want to get too carried away with detail in areas that nobody is ever going to see. So how do companies make textures look cleaner and more realistic? Yeah, so Substance Painter, which we'll get into later, that uses PBR or physically based rendering. And there are a lot of inputs and code involved in the background, but we'll get to see the results, you know, once we shift over to Substance Painter. Until we get to that point, right? And what everybody is still essentially tied to is just the resolution of the photo that you're going to use for your texture. So we'll try to do, I think if we can, we'll try to make I'll show you guys how to make your own textures, right? From real world photographs and things. But because of this projection technique, right, where it is trying to like fire the image onto a rounded surface, right? Having our photos be like super sharp and super clear and taken at the right angle becomes more and more important, right? If we use that method, this is part of the reason, right, why now technology has kind of sidestepped that issue a little bit and either gone for procedural generated textures like you see in Substance Designer, or scanned materials from the real world, right? Where like Battlefront, they scanned all of the props from the original Star Wars movies, which gives you that pixel perfect texture, right? And it's mapped onto the 3D object automatically. But for us, right, however good our 2D image looks is, you know, going to be the best case scenario for how good our object looks. All right, so we got the top and the bottom of the barrel lined up in our UV editor. Now let's look at the sides here. You can see that it is trying to capture the curvature of this barrel, right? And if I move it into place, I can get a decent result just with this as it is. I might not get it to be exactly how I want it, but we'll take a look at what the trade-off is right here. So if I move those barrel pieces into place, right, I can decide, okay, do I want to keep that metal piece? Yes. I'm going to keep the metal at the top. Sometimes you won't necessarily be able to see exactly how the texture is going to look until you click off of the object, because the wireframe mode, right, is actually going to hide some of the imperfections on the texture that the player, right, the viewer will never see. But we can see here, right, there's this break in the texture. So these kinds of issues are the ones that we're trying to avoid. Another thing I sometimes do, right, is if this low poly hard surface style kind of gets on your nerves, sometimes depending on the object, you can, it looks better if you go to this mesh display and choose soften edge. Right, that'll kind of get rid of those sharp low poly divisions and give it a bit of a softer normals for the camera to look at, so you get a bit of a softer reflection of light. But here you can see there's still that split, right? I don't want my textures to suddenly cut off and then jump back into existence in a different space, right? And that is being caused by these small little splits between the wood where it is unwrapped a certain way, right? So if I look at where these pieces are, I can select them on the model, right? It's right here. I can see that this polygon and this polygon are not aligned the way that I would want them, right? So I have a couple options. I think in this case, it might have even flipped them, right? So if I check something, this one, yeah, so this one, the top piece here is actually being mapped to the bottom, in which case I could just get away with flipping it here in the UV toolkit, I could flip that. But I want to keep things simple for today. So let's just select all of these faces on the barrel here. And I'm going to go to UV and choose Cylindrical. So that's going to give me this result where all of the different strips of wood here are now been stitched together, right? And there won't be any gaps along that line, right? Because all of these edges here are now sewn and there's no gaps between them. So they can't be flipped around and things. They're just going to be a little bit more predictable, right? And this works well for simple primitive objects where we have a UV option, right? Cylindrical is definitely one of the more powerful automatic unwrappers. Spherical can also be really, really handy. All right, so that's pretty much all I needed to do to the barrel, right? Once I get that piece into place, now if I deselect it, it looks perfectly fine from just about every angle. I can also switch it back to harden edge if I want more of that low poly reflection. But overall, it looks good from every angle, so we'll call the barrel done. So, Mr. House over here, if you've clicked on the house, you can see that the texture is a little more complicated, right? Because now we have several different material types on one square texture. Yeah. I had to clear it back. Yeah. So what's the question? How do we sew? Oh, okay. So I did an automatic unwrap to sew all of these together. There is a cut and sew menu down here in the UV toolkit. Sometimes when you open this up, this is a floating bar. I normally drag it in and dock it to the UV editor. And then if you do want to cut and sew things, this is a bit higher level, so this is not required for everybody. But you can separate edges with cut, right? And then I can bring that piece off. And if I put it back into place and I go to edge mode, right, I can also, I like to use stitch together. So if you have things that are right next to each other, but stitched together will actually pull the object towards its destination. So the application in this case knows that even though there's a visual gap here, that in 3D, right, these edges are touching. So if I tell it to stitch, it will pull those edges back into place. All right, so for the house, right, even though it's a very simple house, it still immediately gets a little bit tricky to unwrap this object, right? In this case, I'm going to drag the pieces out here to the side, just so I can get a better sense of what everything is. And then I can start to break apart where everything needs to go, right? So if I look at this texture that I've set up, I've got all of the basic textures that I'm going to need for a house in one square texture, right? Rather than having a door image and a window image and a tiled roof texture and a brick image, right? Sometimes if you have a lot of different materials, right, you don't necessarily want all those different image files floating around your assets folder and having to link them back inside of Unity, right? It just increases the amount of work that you have to do. When we're working at a small scale like this, a lot of these things don't come into play, or it feels like a little bit on taking the long way around or taking the slow route. But what you want to think about, right, is like scaling these things, right? If you're going to scale up a game from having one house to having a whole city, right, and now you're going to have like 300 different buildings in your game, and each of those buildings has 6 different textures, right? That's just ballooning the amount of files that you have and the amount of management that you have to do with all those files. It's going to be a lot easier if you can just keep a 1-to-1 ratio of like one 3D object, one texture file, right? Or one group, one folder of texture files if we're looking at Substance for more complicated textures, right? but this is just going to help us manage things a little bit easier. And there's not going to be as much work in converting it from one app to another. So let's just grab a piece here. Let's say we got the roof. If you select the house in, say, object mode, and you just go to UV automatic, right? That's how I got this result here, where what it's trying to do is flatten out all of these pieces and stitch them. But whenever there's, say, like a 90-degree break between, say, this edge and this edge, right? It's going to end up separating that piece and putting it somewhere else. So again, these are my puzzle pieces. Now that I've got them here, I can think about moving them back into place. Right? So if that's where my roof is going to go, right, I have a couple options. First, I could think, all right, maybe if I just plop it on here, how does it look? Use move and scale, and I'm in face mode to select it, right? And I can get a decent result, off the bat. But I can see, that my spider sense is tingling a little bit on this side, and it looks like the tiles are now facing the wrong way, right? So what I could do, select this object, do another automatic unwrap. Now it has made it really big, and it has rotated it. So one thing to remember is not to use rotation necessarily tool inside of the UV editor, unless you're snapping. But the easier way to do it is just to expand the transform menu. And then here it has snapping already enabled. If I click on these little twist buttons, it will rotate it at exactly 90 degrees. Whereas if, say, I rotated it by hand, right, and I try to align it very straight, you'll get these little jaggies, and that causes the textures to smudge down the line. All right, so here, if I line this up again, maybe I want to scale it and make sure the rotation is correct for the shadows. That can be like, okay, roof done, move on to the next piece, right? So once you've got a little piece, you can just leave it in place, move on to the next piece. Typically, I'll think about this in kind of the 3D space, but if it's obvious like this one, sometimes you can just look at it in the UV editor and know what you're looking at. So I'll grab the front of the house, drag that into a space so it shows some wood there. Grab the back, do the same thing. Right. In this case, I'm going to stack UVs, which is something that normally you want to be careful with. Some engines will not let you have two UV pieces stacked on top of each other. You will have to spread them out like this so that they have a little bit of space in between. And then move on to the next piece, right? So I can look for the door, select the door. Like, okay, there's my door piece. Move it on to the correct place and just keep filling up this little puzzle. Same with the windows. Okay, there's the window. Grab it from there and drag it into the right spot on the UV editor. Resize it and then eyeball it inside the app to make sure it looks okay. Windows are a funny one because sometimes it'll look fine in the UV editor, and then you get it in game or something, and you'll realize like all of your windows are reflecting the world upside down. Like if the sky is on the ground kind of thing. But this is just going to be practice for the kinds of things that you'll be learning to unwrap, right? The other thing to keep in mind, though, is the scale, right? Like, is to try and match the scale just visually is tricky sometimes, like especially when you might have an object that's stylized, like this house is a little bit, right? It's not quite realistic. And then you just have to kind of guesstimate where or what size the bricks should be. But one thing you definitely want, right, is you want to have the size of the bricks the same across all the walls. So this is a bit of a problem on this one. It needs to be rotated first. Maybe we can check in edge mode where the top is. Okay, the top is correct. This one, the top is correct. And over here, this one, the top is flipped. So here, I'm going to flip this guy. Top, top. All right, so this is where the stitching comes into play, right? Is because if I have these three brick walls and they're all connected to each other, there shouldn't be a break on the object texture between one wall and the wall next to it, right? These bricks should flow around the corner. And to get that effect, we need to use the stitch together option here. So again, this is under the UV toolkit, cut and sew. And then I'm in edge mode and I'll select one. Well, I'm going to select the object that I want to keep the size of. And then I'm going to choose stitch together. It was actually the opposite side. So on these edges, if I stitch them, so let me stitch all these, I'll get something like this, right? So now I look at this in 3D space, all of these edges, except for the one side, are going to be in a line, right? So now let's look at an object mode. So now the bricks flow around the corner of the house. Okay. That texture isn't exactly where I want it to be, but I did solve the problem of the stitching, right? So now I need to solve the problem of fitting it all on top of the bricks. And just resize it down a little bit and keep it all in a line like so. Okay, last major piece is the window. We put that other window over here. If you have two identical pieces, like we already have one window set up correctly, you can go and select the face, choose edit in the UV editor, copy, select the other face, and do edit paste, and it will pop into place. And that's handy because they'll be exactly the same size. All right, now the leftovers. This is the trickier part, right? It's because now we've got all these little window sills and door frame edges. We've got the bottom side of the house and we've got the underside of the roof, right? Which all have just kind of random textures on them because I haven't managed them yet. These sometimes you can get away with just kind of like smushing them onto a texture and living with it, you know, like it's not a huge deal if the underside of the roof looks like that. Especially something like the underside of the house, right? It doesn't matter what texture we even put on there if it has anything, if we're never going to see it. Same goes for like the top of a skyscraper. Oftentimes, like you can just get away with like spamming it wherever. Yeah, so if we just want to like get it to be all one color, we can just smush that way down into a single color. All right, that's one solution. But I'll leave some of that decision making to you. For something like a windowsill and the door frame, right, this becomes a little bit more how detail oriented you are, right? If you really want to worry about these things, if they are important to you, which in most cases, right, if you're going to be a 3D artist, you are expected to go out and fix these things. The easiest solution, right, is just going to be to take a material and to drag those individual pieces on to that material. That'll create a workable solution. Yeah. But ideally, for something like, especially for say the door frame, is again we want to use the stitch and the sewing so that the bricks will match the ones immediately next to it. So say if we go into edge mode, select that edge, and then we tell it to stitch together. It's going to go find this piece that's missing and stitch it right on to that door frame. So I'll go and do that for the other edges. So I'll click on the edge, stitched together, and then I get this nice texture flowing across the edges here. So house is donezo. At least once we get all those little pieces in place. Yeah, I still left a couple of them. Even if you get lazy, right, and you have some extra pieces, just put them somewhere inside of the U1 V1 square, right? So they're not completely floating out in outer space. But yeah, sometimes this stuff, you know, if especially if something's going to be seen from further away, like it's an isometric game, right? You don't necessarily have to worry about stitching every single little piece in there. But for something high detail, right, especially when in your render, you can see the break between an edge breaking a texture. We want to fix those seams, right? We call them texture seams. So the hard part of doing something like a character model, right, is that something like the face should have no seams in there because the viewer is going to be looking at the face first thing. So this is typically why the faces are kind of flattened out into a mask sort of shape, rather than having, say, like a cut around the eye and then a cut around the mouth or anything, because your eye would be able to spot those slight changes. Session will be up in an hour or two. Okay, so I just want to do one more thing in here. We've got the barrel in the house, which is to show you guys how to use the Revolve tool to turn this outline here into this beautiful street lamp that I made, right, in one easy step. Right, so whenever you have an object that is symmetrical all the way around, something like a bottle, a cup, right, a wine glass, street lamp, anything rounded like this, even the barrel could work with this technique. You can actually swap over to the curves and surfaces here if you want to draw it. We'll do some practice on this next week. But that's how I just want to show you. This is where I created this line in 3D space. So I swapped into one of my flat front view or side view, right? And then I drew this line, and now it exists in 3D. But I can use this neat tool under surfaces called the Revolve tool. So I'm going to go to Surfaces, Revolve, and choose the little box next to it. So whenever I need to adjust some of the options on a tool, right, I'm going to want to choose the little box rather than clicking on the text here. You'll see that the highlight extends. And then when I click on the box, it brings up a little dialog box of options. I could just hit apply, but it doesn't have the settings that I want. So what I want to do is make sure that I'm not outputting to NURBS, because we don't use NURBS. We are gamers, so we use polygons for everything. Then for segments, I'm just going to dial that up to 16 is about what I use for this one to make it a little bit smoother. And the rest of the settings, I think, are fine. So if I hit apply, basically what it does is it grabs that line, right, does a little ring around the rosy and fills in all the gaps. And in this case, since I chose 16 segments, right, it has 16 faces wrapping around it, just like so. Basically drawing around the model. Anthony, was that question in regards to the lamp, or what was that? A question about the barrel? Yeah, so it's kind of working like a pottery maker, right? Where it's like it's going to spin. You just have like an input on one angle, and it's going to, change the overall 3D space around the entire object, pushing it in or out all at once. Why is it chunkier? Yeah, so it's a little bit fatter, I would say. Yeah, you're right. So that's because the position of the line, which let me try and select it. So now this line, because it is a certain distance from the origin point, 0, 0, 0, that's what it's going to determine to when it spins it, right? So if I move it outwards, it spins it wider. And if I move the line inwards, right, I can make it skinnier. Yeah. So if you still have the line that you use to revolve in your scene, just by moving it back and forth away from the origin, you know, the center of the grid here, that's what's going to determine the width. If I delete the line, right, then it's gone forever and it will won't affect that object. I think if I duplicate it, it might also let me keep my original. Yeah, so if you want to save a copy and then keep messing with it, you can have it selected in object mode, and then Control D will create a duplicate object. The original is still going to be tied to that curve, right? But this one will not change. Try to select the line, but I can. I don't know, try to full screen with spacebar, or go to one of the other viewports, and then sometimes, like, I've been dragging over the line and then I shift select the object in my case because I have an object there. But yeah, some people have been having issues with the line selection. So I'm in object mode. For me, I can just click on it, but if that's a widespread issue, maybe I need to investigate that a little more. All right, so last thing is to apply the texture to this piece. So I'm going to hold right click. I'm in object mode with the whole thing selected. Assign existing material, look for the lamp texture. Then I can check out my UV editor, right, and see what's going on here. It looks like the white part of the lamp is in a weird spot, right? So I just need to make sure I isolate the top of the lamp and pop that into the white part of the texture here. And then the rest of the texture, right, is spread out in the gray, blacker part of the texture map. Yeah. So what I've done in my case is I've split it into 3 different parts, but for now, let's just look at doing an automatic unwrap, or since this object is mostly cylindrical, we'll use the automatic cylinder unwrap. So UV cylindrical will give us some sort of crazy result here. Let's see what's going on. It looks like, let's see, where's the top? So let's say I want to pull this top piece out. Oh, we got a little bit of overlap going on over here. Oh, and I also have my selection tool set to camera based. So this is also worth looking at, but let's jump ahead first. So to select the lamp itself, right? I can try to get to a side view. That's going to help me out to do a drag selection. And just grab the spherical part on the top. Right, this is still sewed onto the rest of the object, so I could either go to UV cylindrical, or in this case, the sphere is probably closer, right? So I'm going UV spherical. That's creating some overlap pieces, and then I'm going to scale it down. I'll move it over. Grab the rest of the lamp, UV cylindrical. Oh, looks like I got a little bit of a rebel piece. Oh, that's the very bottom of it, right? So whenever you find a weird piece like this, right, sometimes it is just one little hanger on that needs to be unwrapped separately. So you can just do UV automatic. It still has some weird stuff going on there. I think this is because it did not weld the top here. So if you look at mine, Okay, I've got this weird overlap going on. To fix that, I would go to vertex mode, select all these vertices, and just scale them down to 0. And maybe even do a merge. So I could do edit mesh merge. That will solidify them into one. That has kind of messed with my UVs here. Let's see if we do another spherical. All right, and then this bigger piece, we're just going to scale it down into the black part. Make sure it's not touching the white. And then we'll put the top of the lamp into the white part. And then we zoom out, object mode, deselect it, and see how it looks, which is pretty close to what we want. All right, so that is all of the stuff I want you guys to do this week. I know it's not obvious, nothing about this is easy or logical, right? When you're first getting into UV unwrapping, it's quite tedious, it's quite difficult. Just accept that and go slow, right? It's about the tortoise versus the hare when you get to Maya. If you take things slow and you go step by step, you go methodically, right? It's going to make your life a lot easier. Hopefully you all have a little Clio monster nearby that you can pet and make you feel better when Maya gets on your nerves, because it tends to do that. Maya is a bit of a troll. You don't see the faces on the UV editor. It might be that you don't have the object selected, Sophia. So the UV editor will show you a texture based on whatever object is selected. Yeah, Jamie, I know you want to flex on the assignments a bit. I want you to just use flat stuff for now. We're going to work our way up to substance, and we'll make some really pretty stuff. This is more for like if there's a bug or something in substance that's going wrong, right? I want you to understand like how it's being mapped on there, which you probably do. But I want everybody to solidify, what's going on in the background. What are these algorithms doing for us, so that when things do go wrong, which they do in development always, we know how to either sidestep them, right, or jump into another application like Photoshop and make a quick fix, or where that bug can be found, right, where we can dig down and grab that bug and squash it. Your model is super complicated. That's where the pain comes in, Dylan. So I'm sure Jamie can answer that question in regards to his robot, right? Once you get a very complex object, it means that you got all these faces to deal with, right? This is why in this class I put very strict poly count limitations on all of your objects, because I'm trying to save you from that worry of having to UV so many faces, right? If you've got a 10,000, 20,000 million face object, you have to worry about where all of those faces are on your UV maps. And like Jamie said, you can do individual pieces of objects, right? I could have them separated out a little bit more so that I do just have the roof, and then I have a roof texture like separate, right? Like, and the nice thing about Substance and all of these automated procedures is it can kind of juggle a lot of these files for you, so there's not as much manual like assigning things up. But because we are working in Maya with the intent of bringing it to Unity, right, we do have to face, the facts eventually that we're going to have to bring it into Unity and have it look, we want it to look the same. So the less stuff that we have to transfer over there and have to like assign to the object, etc., the easier it's going to make our lives. And again, a lot of this stuff seems excessive for the size and the simplicity of the objects that we're doing. What we're doing is we're laying the foundation so that when we do need to scale it and make 300 buildings, right, that process is still going to work, and it's still going to be implemented the same way in your game pipeline. You're not going to have to rewrite the book and totally change your methods just because you're making more of something, right? You kind of get rid of some of that inefficiency. So the more efficiently we can make things, right, the more that we can end up making, which is typically what we end up having to do, right, is make a lot of different things very quickly. That is just the pace of our industry. Cool. So get rid of hard shadows. Shadows might be something to do with the viewport renderer. So each viewport, you see, has this little render menu, or if you have it full screen, you can click on the little box next to viewport 2.0 and maybe play with some of these settings in here. I haven't jumped in here too much, but the one that I normally change is the transparency algorithm. Change it to an alpha cut, which works the same way as Unity's cutout. I think it's called in Unity material. But yeah, that's all I have for you guys today. We're right at like 2 hours, including break. So I think let's call it quits there. For the crate, yep, just get stuff from Google. It does not have to be royalty free. You are protected, right? So the texture is going to give you all the results that you really need. Again, we're going to stick to square textures, which doesn't mean that you necessarily have to download a square image, but you will need to crop it down to be square so that Maya will work with it. Other search terms that you sometimes see added, right, are seamless textures. We'll look at how to make these ourselves soon. That means that it, like the bricks, right, it will repeat across the object even when there's a seam or a break there. You can also look for like game texture, right? Like that will also generally return seamless textures. I don't mind if you want to use something stylized, right? But it should still have plenty of detail in it so that I can see any texture smudging, right, or stretching. And if you are a 2D artist, right, and you want to do some painting, feel free to paint your own stuff. It's good practice, right, to start to paint your own materials. And this is how we get this really nice stylized 3D that you see in stuff like Blizzard games or in League of Legends, right? Like all these high resolution painterly style games have a very nice look to them, and they're very popular with gamers. So yeah, just grab any old images from Google. They can be just make sure they don't have like the Shutterstock, junk all over them. We don't want that. I'll show you how to fix that stuff later. But for now, I think just work on creating the crate object, right? We looked at how to do that with the extrude tool last week. Getting the texture on there, right? What I would recommend doing is to have each of the 6 sides laid out next to each other, right, in the UV map. And that way you can customize each of the sides, and then put some stickers or decals and things on your box to make it more interesting or more unique. Maybe you want to make a loot box. Maybe you want to make a dinosaur transportation crate, right? Maybe your crate, maybe you're shipping yourself off to Tahiti, so you put a little air hole in your crate, and it's like you're gonna squash yourself in there with your gaming setup and your desktop so that you can play all the way. Be creative, right? Find that personality, see what you can do to something simple that has a very specific use, a very specific function and scale, right? And twist it so that it becomes unique. Dinosaurs. Rob doesn't want dinosaurs. Yeah, dinosaurs maybe. I don't know. You see a lot of dinosaurs. I know one of my hero animators who animated the flying velociraptor monsters from Avatar. The 4-winged flying creatures, whatever they are. He said his first job was making dinosaurs for a TV program, right? A lot of people start out in the industry by animating dinosaurs, or if you get really lucky, that's kind of like a dream project for a lot of people, is to finally get to animate the big old T-Rex. So we'll get to that point hopefully. Dinosaurs are definitely fun. Any questions that you guys have, you can pop them in chat quickly. Otherwise, I'll be on Discord the rest of the day working on some other stuff. I can help answer questions. Please get me your homework if you have not gotten it to me so far. May not directly impact your grade, but it does come up when I'm grading at the end of the semester. I'm like, oh, this person only needs 2 points to be rounded up to a 1-1 from a 2-1. Were they present for classes, right? Your attendance does directly affect your grade. But when I see that people didn't worry about homework either, it's hard to let people slide and get the benefit of the doubt, right? When they're not responding to the exercises. So yeah, if you can do a quick DM screenshot of your house and your barrel and your lamp to make sure that you got through that stuff okay, and we're able to UV unwrap, and that your Maya is working fine. That's also a good heads up for me. And then the crate is more of just like, when you're feeling more artistic and want to just do something for fun, like we did with the characters. I'll keep trying to give you guys fun stuff to work on. But yeah, UVs are tricky ones. So yeah, don't try and go too fast, right? If you take it slow, and take a step back if you need to. Maya is a little bit more forgiving that way. I find that if I'm in a rush, Maya works against me and trolls me a little bit. Yeah, so make sure you save, back up your files so you don't lose anything. Take screenshots. That's going to be your easiest method right now. Hopefully next week we'll get a little bit more into like rendering, and we'll continue to work towards our first projects. What I want you guys to work on in, say, like the coming weeks is we're going to make a weapon. So I'll show you guys how to do some hand painted textures for the weapon. But yeah, for now, I just want you to practice with the UV editor, see what happens, when you have a simple object, how to get those textures being nice and sharp. And then we'll work our way to more complex objects where things get a little bit trickier because they have more twists and turns. Yep, recordings are on YouTube and will be linked this afternoon. So thanks, guys.